Okay, so this is a video lecture on the Goodwill client memo. So the Goodwill client memo is a deliverable that will be due for your job materials project. It'll be due also for project number 4, editing non-native speakers, and also for your final project. So this is a memo that you're going to use often. This is a memo that um, uh, editors will use often as they communicate, as a means to communicate with writers. So basically what I want to do in this video lecture is talk about what you should include in a Goodwill client memo, talk a little bit about the genre of memo itself, but more importantly give you a resource to sort of look at an example of a Goodwill client memo as a model. And so I will post the Goodwill client memo, an example of it, on the resources page of the course website. Okay, so feel free to download that. It'll be an annotated Word document with an example of a Goodwill client memo. So that'll be there for your reference. So Goodwill client memo, what is it? The purpose of a Goodwill client memo is really basically two main things. The first is obviously to establish goodwill or rapport. So the idea is, as an editor, a lot of times editors work as freelancers. A lot of times editors work on projects with clients for which they're not actually a part of that company, right? So the idea is, in order to sort of be a good business person, and in order to establish goodwill and rapport for future jobs, you use this memo to communicate with the writer. So first and foremost, we want to establish goodwill. We want to create a strong relationship with the writer, manage future work in the relationship. And then secondly, but just as important, we want to actually describe sort of at a very generalized level what it is we did with the document. Okay, so if we think back to the discussions we've had about the relationship between a writer and an editor, and we talked about this idea that there's this sort of inherent conflict between a writer and an editor, because a writer creates a document, an editor edits that document. A writer oftentimes thinks that that editor is changing his or her work, that the editor is changing the writing style or the tone or something like that. And so there's this inherent sort of conflict. And so what we want to do as editors is to just really make very clear what the writer should expect, right? So here's what you should expect from this edit, from what I've done with your document. Here's what we agreed on. We agreed on doing X, Y, and Z. And here's what I've delivered on. And so aside from just creating goodwill or establishing goodwill, it's important for the editor to clarify logistical information, right? So if you use track changes, which you're required to use for the job materials project, you want to say, hey, here's what I used. I used Microsoft Word track changes. Here's how you use Microsoft Word track changes. Here's how it works. So clarifying logistical information. Also clarifying things like, here's the name of the file that I'm sending you. I'm sending you this file that's edited. I'm also sending you back the original version. So making very clear to the writer, here is the files for you. Here's the important logistical information for you to actually understand what I'm editing. And then describing the scope and the edits. So just again, a generalized description of what you've actually done to the document. And then finally a call to action. And we'll talk about what that means in different contexts for editors. Okay, so that's the overall purpose of a Goodwill client memo. Again, the idea is that it's just really important to think about the rhetorical context in which a writer is actually going to be reading your edits, right? Because if you send the writer a document with 100 changes in Microsoft Word, it can be really overwhelming for a writer, right? It could be even misconstrued as offensive. And so in order to clarify that, the memo sort of puts in one sort of concise, distinct place, here's all of the stuff I've done, here's sort of a very clear way to interpret the edits that I've done. Okay, so that's the purpose. General conventions. Memos in general should be pretty concise, right? So 1 to 2 pages. The major sections: an introduction, a section for some logistical information, a section that describes the actual edits, and then a summary or an overview that has some kind of call to action in it. Use standard memo convention, so this should be formatted as a memo. If you've never written a memo before, Google it. There are hundreds of resources, but on the first page you'll find the Purdue OWL, and that's just a great example of a memo. Or take a look on the resources page of the technical editing website, where you can also find an example of a memo. Okay. So let's just quickly walk through each of those 4 sections. So for the introduction, it should be brief, about 1 to 3 sentences. And it's really important to just establish goodwill immediately, right? So the idea is, yes, there's a reason we want to describe the edits. We want to be logistically clear. But a very primary and important reason for this is to just establish goodwill. And so we talked about phrasing editorial comments in the previous video lecture on linguistic politeness. It's the same kind of thing, using the same kinds of strategies. And then closing the introduction finally with a concise overview of the edits and sort of a scope statement. So I'm going to pull up an example and just give you, walk you through the intro really quickly. So here's an example, and this is the example that I will post to the course website. And so you'll see it's the memo format, just kind of like an email almost. But here is my introduction. So I would say this constitutes my introduction here. And let me blow this up a little bit for you so you can see it more easily. As you'll see, I established goodwill immediately, right? So thank you again for the opportunity to review your resume and cover letter. I wish you the best of luck in your job search. Again, a simple 2-sentence thing, but what it does is it just establishes the tone of the memo, right? So again, thinking about managing that relationship with the writer, again, we've got this sort of inherently conflicted relationship between writer and editor. We want to be able to manage that. One way to do that is just to immediately start with goodwill. So I start with establishing goodwill. Then I talk a little bit about some logistical info. So before I get into detail, here's a little bit about track changes. So I use track changes in comments, and just a little bit of instruction to the writer so they're not overwhelmed when they open up the document. So there's some instruction, and then again, just very clearly, here are the files I've attached to the email. Right, here are the files: cover letter edited, cover letter original, resume edited, resume original. And it's got just a really simple explanation of each of those 4 files. Okay, so that's an example of what I would say is a concise and simple introduction to the Goodwill client memo. Okay, the next section is the logistical information. I talked about that previously. So I kind of went through the intro and the logistical information. But again, the technical logistics, original and edited file name, explaining briefly what will be found in individual files. So the next thing we'll do is we'll actually present a scope, an overview of the edits. So what is it that you've actually done? And so we want to present the edits logically for the reader. So that might be chronological. So maybe you want to walk through the document from beginning to end. That might be topical, right? So maybe you want to walk through, like, you've really struggled with grammar, so I'm going to walk through grammar first, and then I'll walk through style, and then I'll walk through visual design, right? So it really just depends on the nature of the edit itself. But you want to be able to present it logically so that the reader, the actual writer of the document, has a really clear idea of, okay, this is what the editor has done. It's very clear. I can follow along with this document. And then we want to discuss the edits comprehensively, meaning you want to cover all of the sort of main categories of edits, right? So if you made style edits, you want to talk about style edits. If you made edits to the visual design or the layout, you want to talk about that. But you want to talk about it at a general level. So it's less important for you to say, on line 9, I removed a comma because that was grammatically incorrect. But it's more important to say, I fixed some grammar issues, including commas, right? So that's sort of an important distinction, because there's no reason for you to go through edit by edit or line by line in the memo. The memo is a place to sort of give them a really high-level overview and give them sort of an introduction when they go and open the document. And then use politeness throughout. So in the last lecture, we talked about payoff statements, this idea of giving the reader a reason why you're making these changes. We talked about using compliments, right? So bookending criticisms with compliments. These are just strategies to continue to make things more polite and sort of establish the goodwill and the rapport between the writer and the editor. So the way that I've, let me zoom out a little so you can see, the way that I have, organized the example that's on the course website is by resume first and then cover letter second, okay? And what I've done within resume is I've divided it into 3 subsections. So I've organized it based on standard resume conventions. So I noticed in my edit there was not a whole lot of past tense. So I said, well, you need to be working on past tense for jobs that you've had in the past. And then I talked about consistency. And then I talked about visual design. Talked about bulleted lists and education. And then I talked about language and writing style. So clear action verbs, show, don't tell, and conciseness. Okay, so instead of just giving him, him, or I think it was a him, instead of just giving him 7, here's 7 things you did poorly, I've organized it in a way that's like a little bit more palatable for the writer. So that's how resume is broken down. Cover letter is broken down just in 2 major recommendations, right? So your cover letter was off to a great start. So again, this idea of building rapport. And then here are the 2 recommendations for you, okay? And then we'll talk quickly about the conclusion. So closing, we want to call to action, right? So if you're actually editing this for a client, this is where you would put things about payment, right? So if you're a freelance editor and you're working on someone's resume and cover letter, this is where you say, thank you again, it was a pleasure. You can send your payment using X, Y, and Z method, okay? And that's the call to action that I'm talking about. And then also final recommendations. So any sort of final, if you can sort of summarize the recommendations, give them something to do after they've read the memo, right? So we want to call them to action after they've read the memo. So here's my closing or the summary. Overall, you've got a great start here. Please let me know if you have additional questions. So my call to action is, I'm not going to charge you. I don't need money from you. Just contact me with additional questions. And then closing with, as I have here, a goodwill statement. So again, I thoroughly enjoyed working on these materials. I look forward to hearing from you. Okay? And so this is an example of probably a longer Goodwill client memo, but one that makes it sort of, makes the editing process sort of more of a personal relationship between the editor and writer. Some general tips for the Goodwill memo: use visual design. So you've noticed in the example, beyond the memo format that you see up top, I've got like headers, italics, bulleted lists, bolding, just ways to use visual hierarchy and visual design to, again, make it easy for the writer to follow, right? So instead of just one long paragraph of text, they can skip around and go, okay, what do I need to do with my visual design? What do I need to do with my writing style? What are some of the things I need to do with my cover letter, right? And so that allows them to skip around, that allows them to scan information, and that just provides that visual design element that makes it more compelling to read. As we've talked about previously in class, this idea of people don't really like to read. It's going to be especially true for a memo like this, where they just want to get the edits and go. So the more you can sort of compel that person to carefully read through and consider your edits, the better off you'll be. Be thoughtful about your organization. So again, I provide you one example of organization. It may or may not be useful for you to split up things into topics the way I have. But be thoughtful about it. Think about it and think about what's best for the writer, what would be most helpful for the writer. Be polite, right? So we talked about those linguistic politeness strategies in the previous video lecture. Think about those. Think about the relationship that you're building, right? So we want to avoid, just as sort of a recap of that lecture, we want to avoid things like, here's what you've done bad, right? You're terrible at using commas. We don't want to say those kinds of things. We want to frame things in positive ways. So you're really good at constructing cohesive thoughts. There could be some improvement in the way that you're using commas, right? So yes, it's an issue, it's a problem, but don't present it as a problem. Present it as a way for the person to improve. And then finally, be thorough, right? So we want to be comprehensive enough so that the reader can read this document as a standalone document and it makes sense, right? So by standalone document, I mean your client can read this and they won't need anything extra from you, right? They won't need a breakdown from you. They won't need a phone conversation from you. This document is good enough to really suffice as the main means of communication between the editor and the writer. Okay, so that's the Goodwill client memo, 1 to 2 pages. It's going to be a deliverable for your job materials project and all of your other projects in this class. So don't forget to do it. Don't forget to take a look at the model that I've posted on the website. And that should do it. All right, we'll see you when I get back.